Thank you, Aparajit and Honorable Minister for Urban Development and Housing, Shri Hardeep Puri, Ambassador Puri, Ms. Gabriela Ramos, Chief of Staff of the OECD, Anthony Cox, the co-host of this conference, Aparajit, Christina, and others who have put it together, friends, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you all to Investing in a Low Carbon India conference hosted by the OECD and the Observer Research Foundation. We've had a great start last evening when we could engage in a very insightful conversation with Dr. Rajiv Kumar on the theme of this forum, which was followed up with a high-level panel discussion that offered insights on a range of aspects critical to mobilizing investments for a green future. Climate change and our response to it is a topic that I personally have spent years engaging on, and it remains a vital part of the research agenda at the ORF. Over the past decade, we at the Foundation have strived to bring this subject to the forefront of the Indian public sphere. The efforts of many institutions, aided by a determined political leadership, has allowed India to put together a progressive and ambitious climate-responsive growth strategy that is lauded by many. In the lead-up to the Paris Agreement at the Conference of Parties, we at ORF were involved in helping connect global and Indian thought leaders and researchers while publishing serious research, including a volume of collected works, The Road to Paris. Since then, we have also produced another volume, The Road from Paris. As part of that particular initiative, we have realized that India will have to lead in discovering financial, technological, and governance solutions that would allow its own transformation and provide a template for the developing and emerging world to grow in a sustainable manner. With this in mind, we launched the Financing Green Transitions Initiative, which has been very generously supported by the MacArthur Foundation and many others, including the GIZ and DFID. This project focuses on ways to help private capital flow towards sustainable infrastructure projects in India. Over the past 18 months, we have published over 10 long-form pieces that assess both the domestic and international barriers that exist for the vast pool of over $100 trillion as per an IMF estimate that is sitting in North American and European pension funds, insurance companies, and other asset classes, earning negligible to negative returns, lazy money. On the domestic front, our work has provided in-depth analysis of the Indian regulatory and political risks that create apprehensions for institutional investors, including the perceived gap between central government policy and state government implementation. We have explored the need for continued maturity of the Indian financial sector, including long-tenured bank debt, more access to project financing, and innovative financial instruments catering to local conditions. However, domestic barriers are only part of the impediment to private financial flows. Our reports have examined the sociological biases inherent to investors within the developed world. We have looked at the capacity constraints within international banks, pension funds, and companies, and their inability to properly analyze projects and assess risks in the developing world. We have deconstructed restrictive international financial regulations such as the Basel norms, which unnecessarily handicap emerging and developing economies. Understanding the barriers are important, of course, but it means little if solutions are not found. With this in mind, our work has focused on offering a number of ideas for the domestic and international financial flows for climate projects in India. We have a roadmap for revamping of multilateral development banks to help crowd in and scale up private capital. We have proposed new risk assessment methodologies that will not unfairly burden the emerging economies. And of course, we have suggested ways to make the international financial system more open to new voices and opinions. To help in this endeavor, we have worked closely with the OECD since the inception of our initiative. We have strived to create a channel of communication between constituencies that have the chance to truly benefit from each other, share learnings and experiences, and co-create a pool of policy knowledge that is available to all. We have also collaborated on scholarly work with the OECD, offering our support to their seminal report titled Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth, and we have sought their scholarship in our own analyses. Our collaborative effort continue with this conference, which we hope will be a home to enlightened conversations on climate finance, and we are particularly delighted that Ms. Ramos is able to join us this morning, and we look forward to her address on this important subject. India's emergence, as per many assessments, will implicate global efforts on mitigating and adapting to climate change. The Indian growth story is evolving rapidly, and is characterized by complex but distinct trends. For example, we can be fairly certain that we will remain a rapidly urbanizing country which would witness an unprecedented addition of over 300 million new urban citizens in the next 25 years. We are witnessing a policy focus on development of urban infrastructure to cater to this new reality, with an ambitious program that is seeking to create urban habitat and new and smart cities. And many of us sense an unparalleled opportunity to create sustainable and affordable energy and mobility solutions that would be a prerequisite for creating opportunities for the youth and to improve the quality of life and living conditions. Urban India and our urbanization is therefore ground zero for both the Sustainable Development Goals and our climate commitments. Minister Hardeep Puri, one of India's finest diplomats, has been tasked to manage this most significant Indian project, and his ministry has already taken a series of steps that seek to catalyze investments in sustainable cities and green infrastructure. I thank you, sir, for agreeing to join us this morning, and we all will greatly benefit from your views and your insights on this Indian project. Let me conclude once again by thanking OECD for their partnership over the past years, and let me welcome you all to a day that promises to be full of rich debates and discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank you for being here, and thank you, Samir, for this partnership. I think it's really, we're very encouraged of what we can do together. Minister Hardeep Puri, thanks for joining us. Minister was telling me that he was actually going to be appointed Sherpa. So we miss you in the G20 table, Minister, but I think that you're doing better in this very important portfolio that now you are handling in the Indian government. Let me tell you, I want to go and share with you some of the findings of a report that we produced last year for the German presidency, and I speak under the control of Anthony Cox, our Director for Environment, and his team, but that will settle the issues that we want to bring forward for this conversation, and I think it will help us to put things in perspective of what do we mean by promoting a development that is really incorporating the climate agenda. And so let me start. This is the report, and I will give it to the minister. Of course, I'm giving the minister the light version because it's 300 pages, but for busy ministers, you have this one.
Thank you.
Now, as I said, in our ever-connected world, we are seeing that many people have been left behind by the benefits of globalization and are rejecting the multilateral system, particularly in advanced economies. I know that in India and other emerging economies, globalization is still the source of great benefits for lifting many out of poverty. The multilateral systems had delivered a very comprehensive agenda for climate and had delivered a many comprehensive agenda for the SDGs. So for us, the question is not whether, but how do we deliver on those agendas? And governments across the world face many challenges domestically. The enormous challenge of ensuring growth is inclusive, improving well-being, while also addressing global challenges like climate change. And so the message that we want to leave with you is that these common goals, inclusiveness, climate, growth, productivity, employment, well-being, are interlinked, and they need to be addressed together. It cannot be done in a silo approach and thinking that while solving one issue, we can forget about the rest. I think they have connections and synergies that we need to be advancing together. Now, who's going to be passing the slides? Can I have the, or do I do it here? Let me see. Okay, here it is. As I said last year, Chancellor Merkel asked the OECD to produce a report for Germany's G20 presidency to show the growth angle of climate change action. So we produced the Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth. And with this report, we turned the debate around to show that with the right policies and incentives in place, governments can generate inclusive growth while reducing climate change risks. And importantly, it shows how to do this by transitioning to a low-emission economy. And let me show you, this is the result of our work. We are looking at the many drivers of this scenario. I think it's a very comprehensive modeling work that our teams have done together. but we're trying to ungrapple what are the elements of this transition. And first, of course, we have the 1.4 effect of net investment to decarbonize. Then we have additional fiscal initiatives supportive of the transition that will add up 0.7 to the growth scenario. We have structural reforms and green innovation, and I want you to focus on that because this is the key element of the whole package. We all need to be doing a structural reforms agenda to advance the economic development. But the fact is that if we align it to the climate perspective, it will just yield higher growth that is not taken into account in traditional growth models that ignore this area for climate growth. And then you have, of course, the cost, energy prices, stranded assets, and regulatory settings to get a total of net effect of 2.5 of GDP. But we also take into account the benefits of avoiding climate damage from increased flooding, storms, droughts, and extreme weather events, the net effect on output prices to nearly 5% by 2050. You have it in the next, here is the total. And I think this is another element of the equation because we are always trying to address those things that we can measure, but we never add up what governments spend in trying to address the catastrophes created by climate change. The benefits will not just be felt 30 years down the line. We can now start reaping the rewards of this approach. The OECD modeling work indicates that the net growth effect of around 1% for G20 economies, including India, as early as 2021. Jobs could be created in the manufacturing of pollution control devices and renewable energy production, or from landfilling and waste incineration to recycling. There's so many jobs that we don't even imagine exist that can be tapped on with this transition. The alternative of doing nothing in the short term would lead to an average losses of up to 2% of GDP in the medium term. And delaying action will also mean that even tougher measures will need to be introduced later to prevent catastrophic climate change. An estimate shows that unmitigated climate change could push 100 million people in developing countries into extreme poverty by 2030. Doing nothing would also exacerbate inequalities. Poorer communities are ill-prepared to meet the challenge of climate change, being less able to invest in ex-ante preventive measures or ex-post mitigation. So the message is very clear. The time for action is now. We have the elements, we have all these arguments, we have the analysis, and governments need to embed their climate policies into their domestic growth agendas. Now, making transition to a low emission, high growth, and resilient economies means significant investment in infrastructure over the next decade. And this is where these two agendas cross each other. Nobody will argue that we do not need to invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure in every single way, in communication, but infrastructure also in access to broadband and many other issues. Around $6.8 trillion a year of investment in infrastructure is required between 2016 and 2030 to meet global development needs. And this is without taking climate into account. And the good news, what you see from this graph, and you will see the whole decomposition of the 6.3 trillion needs in infrastructure investment in terms of energy, telecoms, power, water, transport. But the good news is that the cost of making it climate compatible is relatively small, an additional $0.6 trillion. It's a modest increase of 10% relevant to the incredible gains in growth, productivity, and well-being for both advanced and developed economies. And of course, any politician, and I'm sure Minister, you're thinking about this, yes, 0.6 trillion doesn't look big when you look at the whole composition of the investments, but where this money is coming from, and we also make some suggestions, very concrete. The incremental cost could be offset by savings in fuel cost of up to $1.7 trillion per year up to 2030, producing a net saving of over $1 trillion per year. The OECD advocates a whole of government approach to achieve low carbon growth consisting in three elements, and this is what I shared with you at the beginning. First, pro-growth structural reforms that are supportive of the necessary low-carbon investment. We continue to think of structural reforms as those that will help us produce higher productivity of higher employment. We need to really make it much more a synthetic analysis in terms of how do we build an economy that is resilient and is sustainable. Second, policies target to climate change, carbon pricing, but also well-designed investment incentives. This we discussed yesterday. How do we green the climate finance? And we have here my colleagues that run the climate, the center, the OECD Center for Green Finance and Investment. And third, making broader investment conditions supportive of low carbon investment, removing fossil fuel subsidies, improving planning processes and regulations. Is this integrated policy approach to the climate and growth question that makes this report unique? Climate policies must not exist in a vacuum. It should interact with a large number of policy areas, cutting across competition, labor, education, trade, agriculture, health, gender equality, housing, and more. Acting on climate change can also help reduce inequalities, for example, by reducing exposure of people to air pollution. I know this is something that concerns a lot of the government and the people of India, which generally is higher in poor communities and can thus have a knockoff effect on people's health and employment outlooks. We know that 14 of the 16 more polluted cities in the world are in India. So this is something that I'm sure is close to your hearts. Outdoor air pollution caused more than 1 million premature deaths in India in 2015, estimated at the cost of more than $800 billion. So as I said, everything is interconnected. Now, dwelling down into how do we get the transition right in India? This country, with the large population and growing economy, especially in the technology sector, has enormous opportunities and potential gains from transition to a low-carbon economy. Let me highlight 3 specific areas of action for India. First, getting fiscal policy right for low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive growth. India has made strong progress to green fiscal policies, including by strengthening carbon pricing and pursuing fossil fuel subsidies reform after the complete deregulation of diesel prices in 2014. We know these policies of unveiling the entitlements of certain groups are difficult, but it's very important to get the prices right. And India could go even further. Fossil fuel subsidies remain significant, and India's energy taxes could be applied more consistently and could be increased, and they are currently too low compared to the damage generated by emissions. And this is particularly the case for natural gas, liquid petroleum gas, and coal. Raising excise taxes on fuels and extending taxes to emitters who currently do not face a price would encourage emission reductions where they are cheapest. It will also deliver important co-benefits. Increasing revenue from energy taxes improves fiscal flexibility, and cutting emissions help reduce air pollution. Second element, finance. Strong, climate-resilient growth requires capital, lots of it, and the public sector cannot do it alone. Now more than ever, we need to take action to overcome the remaining barriers to mobilize additional private investment. And this is, as you know, from the billions to the trillions challenge, where we need the private sector to chip in, but we also need the right regulatory framework. And this means improving the investment environment and supporting various financial instruments designed for climate-compatible investment. And I was very encouraged yesterday to listen to the CEO of HSBC, because this is what we need. We need leadership in these institutions that are really transforming the way they operate their business. Guarantees, credit enhancement, and insurance offerings help to mitigate and better allocate risks, while green bonds and securitized loans are playing an increased role in securing a reliable long-term funding basis. India's first green bond was issued in 2015. This is amazing. It's just 3 years ago, and the market is growing rapidly, with an annual issuance increasing from around $1 billion in 2015 to $4 billion in 2017. And we are estimating that the potential to more than double its green bond issuance this year to $8 billion is possible. And as a founding member of Mission Innovation, India is driving forward global efforts to mobilize investment to fight climate change. I think that this is something that the world is looking at, because the experiences and the developments in these areas in China and in India are really very interesting. Third, the transition must be inclusive, progressive, and good for business, what we call a just transition. India's economy, like most countries, is entangled with fossil fuel-intensive sectors. Rents extracted from oil, natural gas, and coal resources account for over 2% of GDP and over 13% of total government revenue, the fifth highest in the G20. To liberate economies from fossil fuels, countries need to adopt a cross-cutting, whole-of-government approach to climate action. Developing long-term emission development strategy to 2015 is an important step to reduce the risk of locking in emissions and leaving a stranded asset with stranded communities alongside them. The OECD is supporting countries on all these issues, and we are ready to collaborate with India to help design, develop, and deliver policies to ensure low-carbon, climate resilience, and inclusive growth. We are really calling for a change of the global growth paradigm. We're calling that if the international community really wants to deliver on what they agree in 2015, what we all agree in 2015, we need to change the growth model. And let me close by outlining two exciting initiatives of the OECD. We have many more. We have the OECD works not only in the environmental departments on water, on the blue economy, on biodiversity, on economic instruments, on financing, on regulatory frameworks, but I'm gonna just mention a few. First, the OECD is leading a G20 mandated project called Financing Climate Futures, Rethinking Infrastructure. These projects build on the Investing in Climate, Investing in Growth reports and help countries make financial flows consistent with a low emissions and climate resilient future. It focuses on the game-changing interventions that move beyond an incremental approach to a more ambitious agenda needed for climate action. Second, this year, the OECD is launching a new program on clean energy finance and investment in emerging economies, focusing on renewable energy and energy efficiency. Right on target for what India is doing, and we want to partner with India, and I think that we are going to be incorporating your views in this work. The objective is to undertake country reviews and work with countries to support implementation and scale up private investment. So, in summary, we know that the transition is difficult. We know that there are vested interests. We know that the wiring our economies from carbon is not easy. We know we need to get the prices right. We know that the reform is difficult, but we know that there is no other way. And so this is the main message that we want to leave with you, is not only to show that with all this information and with all this analysis, the message of the OECD is that we can do it. And it's not only feasible, it's possible, it's accessible, and actually is the only way. And besides, you can do a very good business. So that's the main message. We have been working on trying to develop this agenda going forward. We're working with the G20. We're working with India. We're working with the Samir, of course, Observer Research Foundation, and we're looking forward to advance this agenda with all of you. Looking forward to deliver for a better world going forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Samir. Thank you, Gabriela. I did mention to you that when I was invited to meet the Prime Minister on the evening of 2nd September, in pursuance, I didn't tell you this part, in pursuance of a phone call I received when I was in Colombo, the gentleman who called me and he said, the Prime Minister would like to see you. And I said, certainly, I'll be there. And then later on, it was hinted to me that maybe he wanted to discuss the position of G20 Sherpa. And the background to this is that when I came back from New York and joined, and I was appointed chairman of the RIS, which is a think tank, my friends used to ask me whether I was fully occupied, and I said I was totally occupied and I loved the job. But then somebody suggested, do you think you could do the G20 Sherpa in addition? And I said, well, we'll see. Anyway, so when I went to see him, he looked up at me and said, I believe we've come here to discuss the G20 Sherpa. I said, that's the message I got from your office. We said, yeah, join the cabinet tomorrow, Council of Ministers, and then we'll take it from there. So that G20 part is there. So I think you've got a great job. Enjoy it whilst you can, but then you combine it with the your substantive position at the OECD. Well, Samir, I'm very happy that ORF is collaborating with the OECD. You know, India's own interaction with the OECD has had a bit of a zigzag approach. I think we have entered into different informal arrangements, etc. And I think as we grow as an economy and as we integrate with the global economy, it stands to reason that we should be collaborating more and more with the OECD. Coming to the SDGs, my favorite opening line always has been that the previous set of development goals, the Millennium Development Goals, the thinking for those, the conceptualizing and the design for those was done in the think tank of the West, the OECD. And I always said, as a negotiator in New York or wherever else, as a developing country negotiator, that next time we do a set of goals, we should try and do them bottom up. So, and that is what really distinguishes the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that in the case of the MDGs, clearly, and this is empirically verifiable, the MDGs succeeded because China succeeded in lifting hundreds of millions of its citizens out of poverty, with some help from India. And we did well. But I think when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals, without fail, the SDGs will succeed because India will succeed. And India's success will also mean the SDGs have succeeded. And the good news there is that we incorporated many of the objectives of the SDGs, which started in 2015 when Mr. Modi became Prime Minister in May 2014. And I'm going to spend a few minutes in running you through our programs and how they impact on the climate agenda. But just one or two comments. One is a comment in response to what Samir said about us rapidly urbanizing. I mean, it's like this, you know, the West often described us as a reluctant urbanizer, but you know, the West perhaps was not aware of what the Indian reality really is. And my favorite statistic is that in 1947, you had 17% of India living in urban areas, but then the population was 300 or 350 million. The last census we have is 2011, and by that time, 30% of India lived in urban spaces. And by 2030, and 30% of 1.25 billion. So by 2030, we will have 600 million Indians living in urban spaces, 2030. And that's when the 2030 agenda and the SDGs are due for completing. So clearly, we have no choice but to build sustainable and resilient urban infrastructure. That's the objective. And I don't think there's any choice, it's an imperative. What that means in real terms, we've done our sums, is that we have to build something like 700 to 900 million square meters of urban space every year between now and 2030, which is a Chicago every year. So it's just mind-boggling if you look at it. And if you look at the kind of flack that I have to face, and legitimate concerns of our citizens, navigating through that process will require a lot of political capital, it will require skills, but I think we are at the point where I can say with a reasonable degree of confidence that we're going to get there. And let me start by taking you through 3 of our flagship programs. we skipped that, Shubh, to come to the next one. That Swachh Bharat is the Clean India or the sanitation or Swachhta mission. The background briefly to this is that after being elected in May 2014, when the Prime Minister was addressing the nation from the ramparts of the Red Fort on 15th August 2014, he said by 2019 October, when we celebrate the 150th birth anniversary of the Mahatma Gandhi, he would want India to be open defecation free, for India to have 100% scientific solid waste management. Now this entails both physical targets like the building of toilets, the building of enhanced capacity for scientific solid waste management, but it also entails what is called behavioral change. Because then in a traditional society, many people still think for a variety of reasons that it is better to go and answer the call of nature in the fields outside and so on. So a number of things. But I think the good news here is that the Swachhta campaign, if you look at it in terms of physical targets, the number of toilets we have to build, individual household toilets, toilets that you have to build in what are called community toilets, all that is going very well. But the better news, I think, is that this Swachhta campaign is also becoming what we call a Jan Andolan or a people's movement. And there is a large-scale adoption of this. It is a project of the government which is becoming a project of the people. And why do I emphasize the Swachhta campaign more? It has history to it. The Mahatma Gandhi was speaking at the Banaras Hindu College in 1916, the year before he embarked on a political movement which got India its freedom, which was in 1917 in the case of the Champaran movement. And he said that I went around the temples of Banaras or Varanasi looking for God, and he said I couldn't find the God. He was referring to the cleanliness part of it. There's a very powerful message there. And therefore, Mr. Modi picked it up. A lot of my friends on the liberal left of center part of the political divide said, well, is this an issue that the Prime Minister should be taking up? And even then, when I was not a minister, I used to say, well, this is absolutely the kind of issue that the highest in the land, the chief executive, should be taking up, because this forms the basis of all our other schemes. Now, I only have the responsibility for the urban mission, but this applies to the rural areas as well. And I think this is a movement which is caught on, and this is a movement which is going to set. But this is also, the Swachhta campaign forms the anchor on which our other schemes, like the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana or affordable housing and the smart cities are also anchored, or Amrut, which is a scheme covering 500 cities. Let me now take you to the housing part, the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. Anybody who is even remotely familiar with our urban areas knows that, and I come back to Samir's point about rapid urbanization, we are going to have 600 million people living in urban spaces by 2030. The urban areas already account for something like 65% plus of the GDP of the country. They already account for over 90% of the tax receipts. And the basic difference between the Modi government's approach to the urban challenge and other is that it has been embraced as a win-win. Therefore, no matter which way you look at it, what we've embarked on is perhaps the most ambitious and comprehensive framework of planned urbanization undertaken anywhere in the world. And let me now spell some parts of it out. We did a study in 2011 to look at the overall gap or deficit in housing. What would it take to make sure that every Indian, no matter where he or she lived, would have a home which they could own? And that study threw up a figure of 18 million. That study was subjected to some validation, cross-checking on the ground by the states and the union territories, and they came to the conclusion that what we required was something like 11 million homes. So this Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana, of the affordable housing scheme, as it's broadly called, loosely called, I would say, has four vectors on which it is based. One is in situ slum rehabilitation. Anyone who's familiar with large cities of the kind we have in India and indeed other parts of the developing world know that slums typically come up and grow in the heart of cities, because that's where people come and look for employment, and there is a tendency sometimes to refer to these unfortunate people in terms of, poor and so on and so forth. And I think they are more the victims of our bad and poor policies rather than them having to be blamed. So in 1975, the then government embarked on an experiment where they curtailed civil liberties, and they thought they could lift people from those living conditions and resettle them 100 kilometers or 200 kilometers away. And it came to the conclusion that was not doable. With the kind of robust democracy that we have, you have to provide clean, green living spaces on the basis of development as is, where is. Now, I give you an example. In Delhi, we have a place called Katputli Colony, and if in the last 8-9 months, if there is one area where I think we've got a breakthrough, and we've done a lot of other things breakthrough, is that. Because, poverty has a vice-like grip about it. If you're trapped in that, there are all kinds of people who will manipulate you because they have a vested interest in keeping you that way. So we were able to temporarily resettle 2,800 families in temporary accommodation at a little distance away, and we are going to complete that project by March of 2019. So these 2,800 families will come and live in these new green buildings, far cry from the kind of squalor that they were living in earlier. It was problematic because there is in all such situations a trust deficit between the government and the helpless victims, because there are enough people who will go to these victims and tell them, look, they're taking you away from here because they want to give this space which you have to someone else. Anyway, we were able to use our margin of persuasion. We took some of those people away, but in the process of shifting, another 1,000 families from somewhere else came and occupied the temporary accommodation. So we got flack from all sides. And then the High Court directed process. We've just been able to sort it out and said, well, this is a court directed process. We had 2,800 families who are claimants, and then the others produce paper. It's not easy, but we got it done. That is the point. And when they come back into that area, I think you'll have the demonstrative effect of this on other similar ventures, and then I think it becomes easier as you go along. In the heart of Bengaluru, again, there was a slum right in the center of the city. We were able to construct a absolutely state-of-the-art green building there with sewage plant, treatment plant, all the modern amenities, totally green certified for 8,000 government employees, 8,000. So there is a lot of this kind of work which is going on. The second vector is beneficiary-led development, which is that if you own a traditional home and you're short of money, you can come to the government will give you money to do up your own this thing. Happens typically in places like Goa and other places where people have traditional homes but need some money to. The third is a scheme called credit-linked subsidy scheme, which is a scheme for interest subvention, where what you do is that typically you want to buy a house, an apartment, young professionals or anyone else, and the bank say will give you loans at say 12% hypothetically. You can go to them and if you're in the lower section, they'll give you 6% of the differential interest subvention upfront. for other higher categories, 4% or so. And the final one is affordable housing and partnership, where the state government and the central government will give some loan. But let me first cover you who the beneficiaries could be. There are broadly 3 categories: the economically weaker section, the lower income group, and the middle income group. Now, for an affordable housing and partnership, let's say if the unit that you're finally getting costs 600,000 rupees, typically the central government would give 150,000 rupees, state government 150,000 rupees, and then the beneficiary would raise the rest by themselves. As I said, 11 million homes to be sanctioned and constructed for the urban space. The rural is even larger. Each home would have to be, the title would have to be in the name of the lady of the house, providing a great fillip to gender empowerment. Each home must have a toilet, a kitchen, and all other facilities for a modern green unit. 11 million to be done by 2022. The latest figure we have, Shubh, I don't know, you have the latest figure there? No, this is 47.5 is the figure of end of last month. Actually, the figure as of now is 5.1 million. So out of 11 million, we've already done 5.1 million by, we're what, 1st July now, 2nd July. We are sanctioning at the rate of 300,000 to 500,000 per month, which means that even if we go by the lower rate of sanctioning, which is 300,000 a month, in 1 year, that's another 3.6. By that, even by the 3rd quarter of, or 4th, by the end of 2019, we would have completed a scheme which is to be completed by 2022. If we do at 500,000 a month, we would have completed it by July of 2019. So we had a scheme which was due for completion in 2022, we get it done before the end of 2019. If you go to the rural areas, there by December of 2018, they would have already handed over 10 million homes by December 2000. In my case, I am confident that by December 2018, we would have sanctioned 10 or 11 million, with a fairly large number already handed over, rest grounded and under construction. This has a, housing of this kind has a paradigmatic shift. We're also doing other things. Anybody again familiar with the climate dimension of this? Badly constructed homes produce toxicity, both residential and commercial space. The toxicity can be up to 40% plus. If you build well, you reduce it to neutral, and then if you build really well, these become positive emitters of energy, and that exactly is what's happening. Later this year, we will be having what we call Global Housing Technology Challenge India, in which we invite entities from all over the world which have experience and proven demonstrable technologies. We will invite them to participate in this exercise, and those who are able to demonstrate, we would invite them to partner us in the large programs that there are. As I mentioned, this is only one aspect, building 11 million homes under this category. Between now and 2030, we have to build a Chicago virtually every year. So this kind of technology, so it's also, as you said, Gabriela, a good business. I think there is a win-win opportunity. I now want to fast forward this to the Smart Cities program. We have something like 4,041 cities in India. Most of us, if we had got a free hand, we would have started with 1,000 smart cities, but resource constraints and others. I think 100 is a pretty good start. This process again was unveiled in June 2015. The cities itself were announced 20 in January 2016, and the last lot in February this year. Each smart city typically has to get a PMC or a project management consultant. It takes 15 to 18 months. We don't have any experience of that here. So typically means getting entities and project management consultancy from around the world. Then you have to set up a special purpose vehicle. The good news is that of all the 100 cities announced now, most of them, 71, have PMCs, they have special purpose vehicles. And should we run you through some of the smart city? Yeah. Now we have 10 integrated command and control centers already functioning. What these integrated command and control centers do is that they integrate all urban services, depending on how many you want to put, on large screens like NASA screens. I think you have one of them up there. And what happens is from there you can control water, electricity, crimes. Can you take me back to the last slide, Shubh? Yeah, what has been the impact of these, some of these? In Rajkot, for instance, some of the technology used has resulted in the crime rate coming down by 18%. In several of the other schemes, usage of public transport, many of the others. So these are just illustrations of what the smart city, integrated control and command centers have been able to do this far. I would recommend for those of you who have an opportunity to go to one of these places where these are functioning. As I said, 10 of these centers are functioning and functioning brilliantly. Another 32 are, I think, ready to be inaugurated. And these are big events, which the last one I was there in Naya Raipur, Prime Minister inaugurated, and we're hoping that he will have that, we'll have the possibility of having the others. After the 32, we have what, 23 more in the pipeline. So when I became a minister in beginning of September, I typically faced some cynicism, cynicism on all the schemes. We Indians are very good at it. On the Swachhta, I think, but there's dirt outside my house. So if I were not a minister, I'd know how to answer that question. But I draw everybody's attention to Indore. Indore, we have something called a Swachhta Sarvekshan, which is a kind of competition every year. You rate cities have to compete in a cleanliness rating. And Indore has come out number 1, third year in a row, or second year in a row? Second year. And I had the privilege as part of a previous career that I had of living in some of the nicest cities in the world in terms of cleanliness and so on. And I can tell you, Indore will give any city in the world a run for its money. So, I asked myself a question, what is it that makes Indore tick? And the answer I had, Samir, in the end was a good municipal commissioner, a good mayor, a good chief minister, and of course an excellent prime minister. So why can't the others do it? That's the issue. Well, I think we are following a system of slow but sure naming and shaming. So now people have lost sight of the cities which come out on top. They are focusing more on the guys who didn't make it. And one of these cities around Delhi, Ghaziabad, for instance, has jumped, 300 places? From something like 340 to 40 or something like that. So I think it's seeping into the municipal admin. Why am I stressing on this Swachhta campaign more? Because if you don't have Swachhta or cleanliness, you're not going to get the other parts of the Singh fit. And then it is all ultimately tied up with the main discussion on climate. No, we have enough problems. You've got climate skeptics. I think we are finding a way of dealing with them by just pointing out, to what's happening around us. But as I keep saying, in language which is perhaps sometimes not politically correct, we have two kinds of disasters, natural and man-made. And if we don't get this right, we would have been allowing the man-made part to contribute to the exacerbation of the natural disaster. So in trying to get these urban schemes right, I don't know, somebody here, I think the gentleman there who was introducing me said, since I became a minister, suddenly urban development. No. These are all schemes that started way before my time, and I have no desire to inject myself beyond the point where I'm just merely somebody who's pressing on the accelerator, trying to move it forward. But all this has complete, it's enveloped by the larger climate debate. Now we have got massive amounts of redevelopment taking place. I know I have a young friend from the Aam Aadmi Party sitting here. Now, you know, land is a state subject. You understand? I'm a central minister. In our system of cooperative federalism, the permission on whether you want to allow forestation, deforestation is a state subject. But what happens is, well, naturally you have to redevelop places. So there was massive hue and cry because one of the redevelopment colonies, there were 7 of them, they said that, you know, it's going to fell trees. So because I'm the Minister for Urban Affairs, so they thought we had done it. So there's a healthy game between states and the central government. Nobody asked me what authority I use, but I just stepped into that vacuum and made an announcement. We will not allow a single tree to be cut or felled from now on. Okay? I'm not the Minister for Environment. I'm not the Minister of the Delhi State Government, but I'm a good citizen of Delhi. I was born here, and I've just introduced this fear. And I told the NBCC and the CPW, whoever is doing the redevelopment, listen, friend, go back to your designer or architect, and they are very good architects. I mean, you know, the person who was doing that colony, I'm a great admirer of his. And he said, yeah, sure, we'll redesign the colony. After all, you have a choice on how to do it. And it's not, we're not the first place where you have to do a redevelopment land. There are places, other places in the world, where you have now platforms which will take a tree exactly as it is and move it from here. I also have, I had started this in January, that we had embarked separately on a scheme to plant 1 million trees. And you know, some of the best people who've done work on traditional trees, etc. So that's something we started in January. It's not due to this scheme, etc. But all this has, no matter which way you look at it, you keep coming back to the same debate that you are trying to do. Now, a very simple solution would be that, look, let's not do any building at all. All right. Now, that's not doable because, you know, with the contribution of the demographic shifts taking place in population, we're a democracy. You can't tell a person, you can pick up your bag and baggage and decide whether you want to live in part A or part B of the country. But you have to prepare yourself for those situations. And I think that the urban transformation, my predecessor in this job, who's now the Honorable Vice President, he used to call it an urban renaissance, right? I don't know, I mean, I've heard of the European Renaissance, etc. But I think there's enough pressure coming both from within the citizen, from the citizens thinking in the government, that this whole process of urban transformation is a term I'm more comfortable with because transformation is much more clinically verifiable and you have your objectives. And I think it has to be anchored in that context, that we have to be, as I said, sustainable, green, and resilient. You know, India has what, 7,500 kilometers of coastline. Yeah, and we have, you know, we have problems of too much water, flooding. We have problems of drought. So I think, again, a previous prime minister, and I'm going to conclude with that, he had a very comfortable way of dealing with these things. He had 2 advisors. One was somebody that Samir and I were talking about, who became a minister. The other was a civil servant. And both, one said, don't give an inch in the climate negotiation. This whole problem has been caused by these large countries, you know, who, you know, you should follow what is called PPP, polluter pays principle, get them to pay. The other guy said, look, that's not realistic because you are all yourself, you know, China, India, large countries, we have to do it. So depending on whom the prime minister was speaking to, he would say something with different nuances. He would say, we don't want to be part of the problem, we would like to be part of the solution. So if you took him further, then it said, but the one major difference I think that has come in with Prime Minister Modi, in spite of what the bureaucracy was telling him in the run-up to an international conference, I think Paris, right? He realized what was happening. He said, this has to stop. So he injected India into the vanguard, into the front of the climate district. And they're basically saying that, look, the traditional Indian philosophy, that it's not something we've inherited, it's something we've borrowed from our few generations. So I think you will find India in the climate discussions right up front, very different from the, you know, inward-looking, hard negotiators of the past who were, you know, doing this part of the problem, part of the solution, kind of trapeze act, as I used to call it then. And when you were an ambassador outside, so I used to get a draft, so I used to ask my deputy, which part of the trapeze are we going to do this time? But there's complete clarity now. We go in there and we want to be part of that. And our domestic programs exactly provide for that. And, you can go on blaming people and saying X has done it or Y has done it. But anybody who knows what's happening here knows that if we don't get our greening right this time, we're going to be in deep trouble. At the same time, this has to be reflected in the buildings, in the infrastructure that we are making, and in the overall transformation. So thank you, Samir. I think I've spoken a little longer than I intended to, but thank you very much.